In today's video, you'll hear the story of a nurse who, in her search for a genuine connection, found a predator who knew the secrets she had never shared with anyone. The story begins in the oppressive silence of a small apartment, a silence broken only by the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator and the distant, mournful cry of a city siren. Brenda Johnson sat on the edge of her sofa, the cold blue light of her phone painting her face in shades of exhaustion. It was a familiar scene, a ritual repeated after every 12-hour shift at the hospital. The lingering smell of antiseptic clung to her clothes, a constant reminder of a day spent in the service of others, a day that left nothing for herself. Her physical form was present, slumped in the dim light of her living room, but her mind was 1,000 miles away, lost in the labyrinth of what-ifs and missed connections that defined her late 20s. The loneliness was not a sudden guest. It was a permanent resident of the apartment, a shadow that stretched into every corner, making the space feel both cavernous and suffocating. It was a physical weight on her chest, a quiet ache that the chaos of the emergency room could only temporarily numb. She scrolled through the images on her phone, a meaningless cascade of manufactured happiness. Photos of Kristen Soto, her face bright with laughter on a trip to the coast, her arm slung around her partner. A picture of Jody Garcia's wedding, a perfect, sun-drenched moment, frozen in time. These were her friends, women she loved, but their joy had become a mirror reflecting her own emptiness. The pressure wasn't overt, never spoken in cruel or direct terms, but it was there, woven into the fabric of every casual conversation, every well-intentioned, "Have you met anyone new?" It was a quiet, relentless drumbeat, a reminder that her life was a puzzle with a missing piece. Her thumb hovered over the search bar in the App Store. The name TrueConnect Love had come up more than once, mentioned by Kristen with an almost evangelical zeal, an algorithm designed to find not just a match, but a soulmate. The idea was both laughable and tragically seductive. To surrender one's deepest desires to a cold, calculating piece of code seemed like the ultimate act of desperation. Yet, in the profound silence of that Tuesday night, desperation felt like the only language she had left. The process was sterile, invasive. The app demanded information, not just preferences. It asked for fears, for dreams, for the quiet moments that defined a person. What is your most persistent, irrational fear? What song makes you feel most understood? Describe a moment of profound loss. Brenda hesitated, her fingers tracing the cold glass of the screen. Sharing such intimacies with a machine felt like a violation, but the alternative was this silence, this crushing weight of being alone in a world that seemed to move in pairs. She answered, her words a digital confession whispered into the void. She wrote about her childhood fear of clowns, a specific recurring nightmare that had haunted her until she was nearly a teenager. She mentioned the scent of her grandmother's perfume, a mix of lavender and vanilla, and how its absence was a tangible grief. She typed and deleted, until a fractured mosaic of her inner self was laid bare for the algorithm to consume. A few taps, a profile picture that felt like a lie, a smile from a happier time, and she was done. The app buzzed with an unnerving immediacy, searching for your true connect love. His name was Derek Fisher. The profile picture was disarmingly normal. No posed, shirtless photos, no pictures from the top of a mountain. Just a man with dark, well-kept hair and startlingly blue eyes, a warm smile playing on his lips. His bio was simple, devoid of the usual cliches. It spoke of a love for old bookstores, rainy afternoons, and the quiet comfort of a shared silence. It was as if the algorithm had reached into her soul and constructed a man from her own unspoken longings. Their first conversation was effortless. He didn't use tired pickup lines or generic compliments. His questions were insightful, his responses thoughtful. He seemed to understand the rhythm of her life, the exhaustion that followed a long shift, the small victories that made it all worthwhile. He never pressed, never demanded. He was a calm, steady presence in the chaotic sea of her digital world. Within days, the digital conversation bled into the real world. His messages became the first thing she saw in the morning and the last thing she heard at night. The soft chime of a notification from him was a Pavlovian trigger for a small, fluttering hope in her chest. He seemed to have an uncanny sense of her moods. On a particularly grueling day, when a patient she had grown fond of had taken a turn for the worse, her phone vibrated just as the first tear escaped her eye. It was a message from him. "I know you pour so much of yourself into your work. Remember to save a little for you. You deserve it." The message was so specific, so perfectly timed. It felt less like a coincidence and more like a premonition. She hadn't told him about her day. She hadn't told anyone. Yet he knew. She dismissed it as a lucky guess, a testament to his emotional intelligence. It was what she wanted to believe. The alternative was too unsettling to contemplate. The connection felt real, a lifeline in the vast, lonely ocean of her life. She was finally being seen, truly seen, and the feeling was so intoxicating. It blinded her to the shadows gathering just at the edge of her vision. Brenda's growing comfort with Derek was a dangerous bomb. She had found a rhythm in his digital presence, a predictable and comforting chime that punctuated the relentless monotony of her life. The messages were a constant stream of validation, a digital hand that reached through the screen to soothe her insecurities. He would send her music, recommending obscure jazz pieces or classical compositions that perfectly matched the melancholic mood she was too afraid to admit she was in. He knew when she had a bad day at the hospital before she even had a chance to process it herself. He knew the specific, quiet frustrations of working a double shift, the weight of a dying patient's hand. These were not generic platitudes. They were tailored, intimate acknowledgments of her specific pain. It was a kind of emotional pornography, a voyeurism of the soul. But Brenda was too starved for connection to recognize the violation. The feeling of being truly seen for the first time was an opiate, numbing her to the subtle but persistent cold that seeped into her reality. Her friends, Kristen and Jody, were the first to notice the shift. Their group chat, once a vibrant stream of memes and shared grievances, had grown quiet on Brenda's end. Her responses became monosyllabic, distant. She declined their invitations for dinner, offering vague excuses of being tired, of wanting to stay in. In reality, her nights were consumed by Derek. He filled the space that her friends once occupied, a phantom limb she had come to rely on. One evening, Kristen sent her a frustrated text. "We miss you. You've been MIA. Is everything okay?" Brenda's fingers hovered over the screen, a sense of guilt and shame washing over her. Before she could type a response, a message from Derek appeared. "It's okay to need space. Your friends won't understand what we have. Sometimes the strongest bonds are the ones no one else can see." It was a subtle, insidious poison, a whisper of exclusivity that severed her from her support system. He was creating a world just for the two of them, a psychological bubble that kept the outside world at bay. The apartment, once a sanctuary of solitude, began to feel like a cage. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a canvas for her growing paranoia. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to carry a low, indistinct whisper. The old floorboards creaked in the middle of the night, not with the natural settling of a house, but with the quiet, deliberate pace of footsteps. She would sit motionless in the dark, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, straining to hear something, anything, to confirm her fears. She would try to rationalize it away, dismissing it as the stress of her job, the lingering exhaustion. But the feeling of being watched was a physical presence in the room, a palpable chill that raised the hair on her arms. The first major crack in her manufactured reality came after a particularly difficult shift. The air in her apartment felt stale and heavy. As she walked through the door, she moved on autopilot, shedding her uniform. It sent a stark reminder of the sterile hospital. She stepped into the shower, the hot water a blessed relief against her tense muscles. The steam filled the small bathroom, obscuring her reflection, and for a moment she felt a profound, private sadness. A slow, heavy sob escaped her lips. It was a secret, a moment of unadulterated vulnerability that she reserved for the quiet sanctuary of the shower. When she stepped out, wrapped in a towel, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Derek. "I wish I could be there to hold you. I know how much you hate to cry alone." The words hit her like a physical blow. The skin on her arms goosebumped, a cold dread twisting in her stomach. She hadn't been on the phone. She hadn't been in a call. The phone was on the counter, facing up. There was no way he could have known. The thought that he could, that he did, made the towel feel like a shroud. She began to search for clues, for any rational explanation. She checked her phone settings, her social media, her email. She found nothing. She ran a virus scan, a paranoid gesture in a world where the viruses were no longer code, but people. She convinced herself it was an accident, a brilliant guess, a line he had used before on other women. But the feeling of being exposed, of being seen in her most private and sorrowful moment, was a wound that would not heal. The next day, Kristen sent her a message. "Hey, you okay? We heard you were being a total B to everyone on the group chat." Brenda stared at the message, her brow furrowed in confusion. She hadn't been on the group chat in days. She hadn't said anything. She wrote back, a flurry of apologetic messages, her fingers flying across the screen. Kristen's response was immediate and cold. "No need to lie. We have the screenshots. Look, just call us when you're ready to stop being weird." The screenshots that followed were a cold bucket of water to the face. They were from her number, from her phone, but the words were foreign, cruel. Words she would never, could never say. The tone was sharp and vicious, a calculated attack on her friends. It was at that moment, sitting alone in her apartment, the scent of her own terror filling the air, that she knew. He was in. He was inside her life, a parasite she had willingly invited in. He wasn't just observing. He was actively poisoning her world. Her phone, once a source of connection and comfort, was now a window, and she was on full display. The line between her digital self and her physical self was gone, and there was nowhere left to hide. She saw it then, not in a reflection or a shadow, but in the glint of the tiny lens on the top of her laptop screen. A single, malevolent red dot that pulsed with a quiet, unending life. The single point of red light was a rupture in reality. For a frozen moment, Brenda's mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. The pulsing glow was an anchor, pulling her down from the abstract dread of paranoia into the cold, hard certainty of violation. It wasn't a ghost in the shadows or a creak in the floorboards. It was a physical, undeniable presence. An eye, a mechanical, unblinking eye that had been watching her, cataloging her moments of private grief, her quiet solitude, her unguarded vulnerability. The silence in the room became absolute, a vacuum where sound could not exist. Her breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful knot. The apartment, Her sanctuary, her shell against the chaotic world of the hospital, had been a terrarium all along, and she was the specimen, pinned and observed. Panic, when it finally came, was not a scream but a silent, frantic surge of adrenaline. Her limbs moved with a jerky, disconnected motion, as if commanded by a stranger. She lunged forward, her hands slapping the laptop shut with a sharp crack of plastic. The gesture was futile, she knew, but it was a primal, desperate need to close the eye, to sever the connection. Her gaze then fell on her phone, lying inert on the coffee table. Its dark screen was a black mirror, but she could feel the presence of its lens, another potential window for him to peer through. She snatched it, her fingers fumbling, and turned it over, pressing its face into the wood of the table as if to blind it. Her eyes scanned the room, a wild, terrified inventory of every piece of technology. The smart speaker in the corner, the tablet on the kitchen counter, even the small, unassuming television. Each device was now a potential spy, a Trojan horse she had willingly brought into her home. She moved through the room like a ghost, unplugging everything, yanking cords from the wall with a violence that was born of pure terror. The sudden silence that followed, the absence of the low electronic hum of modern life, was more deafening than any sound. It was the silence of a tomb. She retreated to the corner of the sofa, pulling a blanket around her shoulders, a flimsy shield against an invisible enemy. Her mind raced, replaying every conversation, every perfectly timed message from Derek. It was a grotesque highlight reel of her own manipulation. The message about her work, the uncanny knowledge of her moods, the cruel fabricated texts that had alienated her from Kristen and Jody. It was all part of a meticulous, calculated design. He hadn't just been watching, he had been directing. He was the author of her recent misery, the architect of her isolation. The realization was a slow, creeping poison, seeping into every memory she had of him, tainting every moment of perceived connection with the bitter taste of deceit. The warmth she had felt was a lie. The understanding she had craved was a weapon. He had seen her brokenness, not as a wound to be healed, but as an opening to be exploited. The night was an eternity of hyper-vigilance. Every creak of the building, every distant siren, was a potential sign of his approach. She sat in the dark, her body rigid, her ears straining for any sound. Sleep was an impossible luxury. To close her eyes would be to surrender, to leave herself vulnerable to the unseen watcher. She thought of Kristen, of Jody. The pain of their perceived betrayal was now replaced by a chilling understanding. He had wanted her alone. A predator always separates its prey from the herd. She felt a desperate urge to call them, to explain. But what could she say? That a man from a dating app was watching her through her laptop? That he was sending messages in her name? It sounded like the ravings of a mad woman. He had not only invaded her home, he had colonized her credibility, leaving her stranded on an island of unbelievable truth. The days that followed were a descent into a quiet, suffocating madness. Brenda existed in a state of constant, low-grade terror, a hum of anxiety that vibrated just beneath her skin. She moved through her life like a phantom, her actions mechanical, her mind a fortress under siege. At work, she was a ghost in scrubs, performing her duties with a cold, detached precision that frightened her colleagues. The easy warmth she once shared with patients was gone, replaced by a brittle, professional shell. She could feel their eyes on her, feel the whispers that followed her down the sterile corridors. Her colleagues saw a woman on the verge of burnout, a dedicated nurse crumbling under the weight of the job. They had no way of knowing that the true source of her horror was not in the hospital's sterile rooms of life and death, but in the silent, watchful glow of her own home. Her apartment had become a hostile territory. She covered every lens she could find with thick black tape, the laptop, the phone, the tablet. But the gesture felt hollow, a child's defense against a monster in the closet. The threat was not in the hardware. It was in the ether, in the invisible network that connected her life to his. He didn't need a lens to see her. He was already inside. She began to live in a self-imposed sensory deprivation. She kept the lights off, preferring the dim, shadowy twilight of the city filtering through her blinds. She stopped listening to music, the silence a preferable alternative to the thought that he might be listening with her, judging her taste, analyzing her emotional response to a particular melody. She ate cold food straight from the can, the act of cooking too intimate, too revealing. Her life was stripped down to its barest essentials, a desperate attempt to offer him nothing, to become a blank slate, a ghost in her own home. Meanwhile, Kristen Soto and Jody Garcia were adrift in a sea of confusion and hurt. The cruel, dismissive messages had been followed by a wall of absolute silence. Their calls went unanswered. Their texts were left on read. They sat in their usual coffee shop, the empty chair where Brenda should have been a silent accusation. Kristen, ever the pragmatist, scrolled through the fabricated texts again, her brow furrowed. The words were venomous, a targeted attack on insecurities she had only ever shared with Brenda. It was a calculated act of cruelty that felt both deeply personal and utterly alien. Jody, ever the peacekeeper, wrung her hands, her expression a mixture of worry and sorrow. She suggested they go to Brenda's apartment, to confront her, to understand. But Kristen shook her head, the hurt in her eyes hardening into a protective wall. The Brenda who wrote those words was not the Brenda they knew, and she was not a woman who wanted their help. Derek's plan was working perfectly. He had severed the lines of communication, leaving Brenda utterly alone, adrift in a sea of paranoia that he himself had created. Her only connection to the outside world was him. Derek's messages continued, a steady, relentless drip of psychological torture. They came from a new number each day, bypassing her attempts to block him. They were no longer comforting or seductive. They were displays of power, demonstrations of his omniscience. One afternoon, as she sat in the oppressive silence of her apartment, a new message arrived. Lavender and vanilla. It's a beautiful scent, a beautiful memory. Brenda froze, the phone slipping from her numb fingers, the scent of her grandmother's perfume. It was a detail she had entered into the True Connect Love app, a piece of digital bait she had offered up in her loneliness. But his next message was different. Attached to it was an image, a low-resolution, slightly blurry photo of her grandmother, taken years ago at a family picnic. It was a photo from a private digital album stored deep in a cloud service she hadn't accessed in years. The bottom of the photo was time-stamped, 2012. He hadn't just read her profile. He had excavated her entire digital life. He had walked through the locked rooms of her past, sifting through her memories, her photos, her private documents. The violation was absolute. He was not just a stalker. He was a grave robber of the digital soul, and he had laid all her ghosts bare. The feeling was not one of fear, but of a profound, soul-crushing despair. There was no part of her that he had not touched, no memory that he had not tainted with his unseen presence. She was an open book, and he had read every single page. The photograph on her screen was not just an image. It was a declaration of ownership. He had laid claim to her past, to the sacred, untouchable moments that constituted her history. The feeling of violation was so profound it bordered on physical sickness. Brenda stumbled back from the phone as if it were venomous, a wave of nausea rolling through her. She felt a phantom touch on her skin, the cold, clinical assessment of his gaze not on her body, but on her memories. He had seen her as a child, In the awkward, innocent years before, the world had laid its heavy hands on her. He had seen her family, her grandmother, a woman whose memory was a holy relic to her, and he had taken that image, that sacred piece of her, and used it as a tool of terror. The despair was a black, suffocating tide, pulling her under. There was no escape. He was not a stranger peering through a window. He had become a part of her, an invasive species that had taken root in the very soil of her identity. His messages began to change in tone. The simple, taunting displays of omniscience gave way to something far more sinister, a twisted form of digital evangelism. He began to explain his philosophy, to frame his torment as a form of salvation. The texts that arrived on her phone, always from a new, untraceable number, were mini-sermons on the nature of connection and loneliness. He wrote about the superficiality of modern relationships, the hollowness of social media, the performance of happiness that everyone engaged in. He positioned himself as a savior, a digital messiah who could see past the masks that people wore. "The world doesn't see you, Brenda," one message read. "They see a nurse, a friend, a daughter. They see a role you play. I see the truth. I see the fear and the longing you hide from everyone. Only I can give you the connection you truly crave." He was attempting to reframe his surveillance as a form of profound intimacy, his control as a form of care. It was a masterful act of psychological warfare, designed to break her down, to make her question her own definition of love and connection, to make her believe that this violation was, in fact, a gift. He was trying to convince her that her cage was a sanctuary. From the outside, Brenda's world had simply gone dark. Kristen Soto stood before her friend's apartment door for the third time that week, her knuckles sore from knocking. The silence from within was absolute, a heavy, unyielding wall. She pressed her ear to the cold wood, listening for any sign of life, a footstep, a television, a cough. There was nothing. It was as if the apartment had been abandoned. Its occupant vanished into thin air. Kristen's frustration had long since melted away, replaced by a growing, gnawing fear. This wasn't Brenda being moody or distant. This was something else, something wrong. She had talked to Jody, and they both shared the same cold sense of dread. The cruel texts, the sudden disappearance, it didn't add up. It was a puzzle with missing pieces, and every possible solution was more terrifying than the last. Kristen's final knock was a heavy, defeated thud. She left a small handwritten note. "Brenda, please, just let us know you're okay," and slid it under the door, a tiny paper boat cast into a silent, unmoving sea. She walked away from the apartment building, the feeling of helplessness a bitter taste in her mouth, never knowing that her friend was just a few feet away, a prisoner in her own home, listening to her footsteps retreat down the empty hallway. Inside, Brenda had become a creature of shadow and silence. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of her apartment, and even that felt too large, too exposed. She spent her days in a state of suspended animation, moving only when necessary. The tape over the camera lenses was a constant, mocking reminder of her powerlessness. She began to see his influence everywhere, in the patterns of dust motes dancing in a sliver of sunlight, in the way the shadows stretched and warped as the sun set. Her rational mind, the part of her that could diagnose an illness or calculate a dosage with unerring accuracy, was losing its grip. The line between the real and the imagined was blurring. Was the faint whisper she heard at night just the wind? Or was it his voice, seeping through the walls? Was the flicker of a street lamp outside her window a simple electrical fault? Or was it a signal? He had pushed her to the very edge of her sanity. to a place where the world itself was an extension of his will. She felt herself becoming undone, her identity unraveling thread by thread, until all that was left was the raw, primal fear of the prey. The end of the week brought a new kind of message. It was not a text, but an email, appearing in her inbox with a subject line that made her blood run cold. "Your graduation." She opened it with trembling hands. It was a single, high-resolution image, a photograph of her, radiant and smiling, at her nursing school graduation, and standing just behind her in the crowd, partially obscured but undeniably present, was him, Derek Fisher. His face was younger, his expression unreadable. A ghost in her past she had never known was there. He had been watching her for years. This wasn't a recent obsession born from a dating app. This was a long, patient hunt. The app had not been the beginning. It had been the end, the final closing of a trap that had been set for her long ago. The depth and timeline of his obsession were beyond comprehension. He was not just an intruder in her present. He was a silent, unknown architect of her entire adult life. The email was followed by a final, simple text message. It arrived with the cold, final finality of a death sentence. It contained only an address, a time, and 3 words. "Come see the truth." It was not a request. It was a command. And in that moment, Brenda knew that her time hiding in the shadows was over. To stay in the apartment was to slowly suffocate, to let her mind be completely eroded by his psychological siege. To go was to walk into the lion's den, but it was also the only way to see the face of her tormentor, to understand the true nature of the prison he had built for her and the other women he had saved. The choice was between a slow death and a dangerous, uncertain confrontation. With a deep, shuddering breath, she stood up, the first real decision she had made in weeks solidifying in her mind. She would go. She would see. She pulled the black tape from her phone's camera, the ripping sound a small act of defiance, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she stared directly into the lens, a silent message to the man on the other side that the hunt was about to change. The act of peeling the tape from the lens was a declaration. It was not an act of surrender, but of cold, calculated defiance. In that moment, staring into the unblinking eye of her phone, Brenda felt a profound shift within herself. The terror that had paralyzed her for days did not vanish. Instead, it crystallized, hardening from a nebulous, suffocating fog into a sharp, jagged weapon. The fear was still there, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach, but it was now accompanied by a sliver of something else, a grim, resolute purpose. He had wanted her to feel like prey, a helpless creature caught in his web, but the prey was now staring back at the hunter, a silent challenge, passing through the invisible streams of data that connected them. The hunt had, indeed, changed. She was no longer hiding. She was walking toward the spider. She moved with a deliberate, almost dreamlike calm. The frantic energy of her previous panic had been burned away, leaving behind the quiet, steady focus of a surgeon before a critical incision. She dressed not for a confrontation, but for an observation. Plain, dark clothing, comfortable shoes, nothing that would stand out, nothing that would make a sound. She tied her long brown hair back, the gesture both practical and symbolic, a pulling together of her fractured self. Every mundane action was imbued with a heavy significance. The click of the lock on her apartment door as she left was a sound of finality, a closing of a chapter of her life that had been defined by hiding. She did not know if she would ever return to this place, or if the woman who returned would be the same one who was now walking into the lion's den. The city at night was a sprawling, indifferent beast, a network of light and shadow that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Brenda walked through its arteries, a solitary figure in a river of anonymous souls, But she did not feel anonymous. She felt utterly, terrifyingly exposed. Every street corner, every storefront, every passing bus was adorned with the glassy, vacant stare of a surveillance camera. She had never noticed how many there were, a silent, unblinking army of witnesses to the city's nightly dramas. Now each one felt like an extension of him, another one of his eyes tracking her progress. She saw his face in the reflections of shop windows, a fleeting, distorted ghost in her periphery. She heard his whisper in the rustle of a plastic bag caught in the wind. He was the city, and she was a trespasser in his domain. The address he had sent was in a part of town she had never been to, a quiet, affluent suburb where the houses were large and the streets were lined with perfectly manicured trees. It was a place of curated perfection, a manufactured reality where nothing bad could ever happen. The house itself was a monument to sterile modernity. A cube of glass and white concrete, it stood on a pristine lawn, its large windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. There were no overgrown bushes to hide in, no dark corners to conceal a threat. It was a house designed to be seen, to project an image of transparency and openness. It was the architectural equivalent of Derek's dating profile. Perfect, alluring, and a complete and utter lie. As Brenda walked up the stone pathway, the manicured grass crunching softly under her feet, a profound sense of wrongness settled over her. This was not the lair of a monster. This was the home of a successful, well-adjusted member of society. And that was, somehow, infinitely more terrifying. The front door was a single, imposing slab of dark wood. She raised her hand to knock, her knuckles hovering just inches from the surface, but before her skin could make contact, the door swung silently inward. He had been waiting. He had been watching her approach. The man who stood in the doorway was the same man from the profile picture, yet entirely different. In person, Derek Fisher's charisma was a physical force, a palpable aura of calm and confidence that seemed to warp the very air around him. His blue eyes, so warm in the photograph, were in person as cold and clear as chips of ice. He smiled, a slow, easy smile that did not reach his eyes. There was no surprise in his expression, no tension. He looked at her as a collector would look at a prized specimen finally arriving for display. He did not speak. He simply stepped aside, a silent, proprietary gesture of invitation into his perfect, sterile home. The interior of the house was as immaculate as the exterior. White walls, minimalist furniture, polished concrete floors. It was less a home than a gallery, a space designed to be looked at, not lived in. The air was cool and still, and the only sound was the low, almost imperceptible hum of electronics. Brenda's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her face was a mask of cold composure. She walked past him, into the center of the vast, open-plan living room. Her eyes scanned the space, searching for the source of her torment, for the bank of monitors, for the evidence of his crimes. But there was nothing, just clean lines, expensive art, and the suffocating silence. He followed her, his footsteps making no sound on the polished floor. He moved with a predatory grace, a silent, circling shark in his own pristine aquarium. He stopped in front of the far wall, which was dominated by a massive, wall-mounted television. The screen was black, a dark, reflective void that mirrored the room in perfect, distorted detail. It was in that reflection that Brenda saw it, not on the screen, but in the dark, glassy surface, the faint, unmistakable glow of dozens of smaller screens, their light too dim to be seen directly, but their presence undeniable in the mirror of the television. They were behind the wall. He saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes. His smile widened, a slow, chilling expression of triumph. He raised a small, sleek remote and pressed a button. A section of the pristine white wall slid away with a soft, hydraulic hiss, revealing what lay within. It was a command center, a digital panopticon. Dozens of monitors of all sizes were mounted in a seamless, glowing mosaic, each one displaying a different life. A woman sleeping, her face peaceful and unaware. Another crying silently in her car. A third, laughing with friends in a coffee shop. A fourth, staring blankly at her own reflection in a bathroom mirror. It was a symphony of stolen intimacy, a gallery of private moments, curated for an audience of one. Brenda recognized the interface on some of the screens, the pastel colors of a period tracking app, the serene blue of a meditation guide, the stark, text-based layout of an online therapy portal. He wasn't just hacking cameras. He was siphoning data from the very services women use to manage their lives, their health, their minds. He was stealing their vulnerabilities directly from the source. The revelation was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, cold flood. The sight of the monitors, the sheer scale of the violation, was an obscenity that her mind struggled to comprehend. Brenda stood frozen, a statue in the center of the room, her gaze sweeping across the wall of stolen lives. It was a silent, flickering tapestry of human sorrow. She saw faces twisted in grief, bodies curled in lonely beds, fingers wiping away unseen tears. There were no moments of joy, no scenes of mundane happiness. Every screen was a window into a moment of profound vulnerability. He had not collected women. He had collected their pain. He had curated an exhibition of their deepest wounds, a museum of silent screams. The low, almost subsonic hum of the servers behind the wall was the only sound, a mechanical heartbeat powering this grotesque theater of suffering. Derek stood beside her, his presence a calm, authoritative cancer. He was not gloating. His demeanor was that of a scholar, a curator proudly displaying his life's work. The narrator would describe how he gestured towards the wall, his movements economical and precise, as if he were a doctor presenting a complex case to a student. He did not speak of them as victims, but as projects. He pointed to a screen showing a young woman staring blankly at a rain-streaked window. Anhedonia, he would have said, his voice a low, clinical murmur, incapable of feeling pleasure. Her digital footprint was a flat line of gray. I introduced a specific color, a specific piece of music into her feed, a trigger. Now she feels something, even if it's just melancholy. He moved to another screen, one showing a woman meticulously arranging and rearranging objects in her apartment, a clear display of obsessive-compulsive behavior. Control, he would have explained. She lost her job, and her world fell apart. She tries to control her environment to compensate. I provide the chaos. I move a book when she isn't looking, through a connected device. I disrupt her patterns. It forces her to adapt, to become stronger. He saw himself as a therapist, a puppet master pulling the strings of their digital lives to force a psychological evolution. The apps were his surgical tools. His history as a cybersecurity engineer, a man once paid to find the weaknesses in the digital fortresses where people stored their lives, had given him the keys to every kingdom. He understood the architecture of these apps, the lazy security protocols, the way they were designed to harvest and share data for profit. He hadn't broken in through the front door. He had built a secret passage in the foundation when the buildings were first constructed. He explained, through the narrator's description of his calm, dispassionate lecture, that vulnerability was a commodity. Therapy apps, period trackers, meditation guides, even the microphones in their phones that detected the sound of crying. They were all open-source emotional diaries, and he was their most dedicated reader. He didn't hunt for women. He subscribed to their feeds of despair. Brenda's eyes scanned the wall, searching for a familiar face, a sign that she was not alone in this specific horror. And then she saw it. On a smaller screen, tucked away in the corner, was her own face. It was a still image, her profile picture from the True Connect Love app. Below it, in a stark white font, were the words, Brenda Johnson, status, integration. The word sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. She was not a potential project. She was an active one. The app had not been the beginning. It was the final stage. He had been in her life long before that, watching through the cracks in her digital armor, waiting for the precise moment of weakness to present himself as the cure to the loneliness he had been so carefully observing. She was just another specimen, another butterfly to be pinned to his collection. As her gaze drifted from her own static image back to the living, breathing feeds, she began to notice a horrifying consistency. The backgrounds, the specific shade of gray on a wall, the type of minimalist furniture, the way the light fell through a large floor-to-ceiling window. She saw it on one screen, and then another, and then a third. It was a detail that was both unremarkable and utterly impossible. The women on the screens, the ones crying in their cars or sleeping in their beds, were not in their own homes. They were here, in this house. The command center was not just a remote observation post. It was the nerve center of a physical prison. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. The women were not just digital ghosts he tormented from afar. They were here, somewhere under this same roof, living out their curated lives, unaware that they were the stars of his grotesque exhibition. He followed her gaze, his cold blue eyes missing nothing. He saw the dawning horror on her face, the shift from understanding the digital violation to understanding the physical one. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent confirmation of her worst fear. He then turned his attention to one of the largest screens, one that showed a live feed of a beautifully decorated, serene-looking bedroom. A woman with long, dark hair sat on the edge of the bed, her back to the camera, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Derek watched the screen with an expression of paternal concern, a look of deep, unsettling empathy. He picked up a small microphone from a console. He did not speak into it. He simply cleared his throat, a soft, almost inaudible sound. On the screen, the woman's head immediately shot up. She stopped crying. She turned, not towards the camera in her room, but towards the wall, as if she could hear him, as if she were a loyal dog responding to her master's call. She looked directly at the lens, and for the first time, Brenda saw her face clearly. And on her face was not an expression of fear or of captivity. It was an expression of pure, unadulterated adoration. The woman on the screen mouthed a single, silent word to the hidden camera, a word that shattered the last remnants of Brenda's understanding of the world. Thank you. The two words, mouthed silently through the cold barrier of the screen, were a semantic bomb that obliterated Brenda's understanding of her reality. Thank you. The gratitude in the woman's expression was not feigned. It was a look of pure, serene devotion, the look of a follower gazing upon a prophet. In that single, silent moment, Brenda's perception of the horror shifted on its axis. This was not a prison. It was a temple. Derek was not a jailer. He was a god, and these women were his willing acolytes. The horror was not that they were trapped, but that they believed they were free. The sterile white room, with its humming servers and its wall of stolen souls, was not a dungeon. It was a sanctuary they had chosen. Her own terror, her desperate fight for freedom, was, in their eyes, a form of blasphemy. Her mind, reeling from the impact, desperately sought a framework, a name for this brand of madness. The words Stockholm Syndrome felt too simple, too clinical to capture the depth of the psychological architecture before her. This was something more insidious. Derek had not captured their bodies and waited for their minds to follow. He had captured their minds first. He had used the digital ether to become an intimate whisper in their loneliest moments, a comforting presence in their deepest despair. He had become the only voice that mattered, the only one that truly saw them. By the time they walked through his door, they were not entering a prison. They were making a pilgrimage. He had not broken them. He had offered them a new, more beautiful cage and convinced them it was a home. The woman on the screen, the one with the adoring eyes, was a case study in his method. Brenda's gaze was drawn back to the monitor, her mind now a cold, analytical engine, the nurse in her assessing a symptom. The woman's room was perfect. The lighting was soft. The colors were muted and calming. There was a vase of fresh flowers on her nightstand. It was a space of curated tranquility. This was not the environment of a victim. It was the reward of a true believer. Brenda watched as the woman turned from the camera and picked up a book, her movements fluid and unhurried. She was at peace. The sight was more terrifying than any scream, any display of violence could ever be. It was the quiet, smiling face of a soul that had been completely and utterly colonized. Derek stood beside Brenda, a silent, expectant God. He had shown her his creation, his garden of repurposed souls, and now he was waiting for her to understand, to appreciate the artistry of his work. The narrator would describe the shift in his posture, a subtle relaxation, the quiet confidence of a master who has just revealed his magnum opus. He did not need to speak. The evidence was all around them, flickering on the dozens of screens, each one a testament to his power. He had not just hacked their devices, he had hacked their faith. He had found the core vulnerability not in their software, but in their humanity, the desperate, primal need to be understood. And he had become the sole provider of that a la carte salvation. He was the answer to a prayer they didn't even know they were whispering into the uncaring void of the internet. Brenda's own reflection in the dark glass of the main screen was a stark, jarring contrast to the placid faces of the other women. Her eyes were wide with a terror they could no longer feel. Her face was a mask of a sanity they no longer possessed. She was the anomaly, the failed experiment, the one soul who had seen the face of God and called him a monster. She understood then that her fight was not just against him, but against them. To escape, she would have to navigate not just his technological web, but their collective, unshakable faith. The thought was a crushing weight. How do you save someone who doesn't believe they need saving? How do you break the chains of a prisoner who has fallen in love with their cage? The path to her own survival was not through a door, but through the labyrinth of their devotion. The weight of her new reality was a physical pressure, making the air in the room thick and hard to breathe. Brenda's eyes, now cold and analytical, scanned the wall of monitors again, but this time she was not looking at the women as a collective. She was searching for an individual, for a crack in the serene, placid facade of their devotion. Her gaze settled on one of the larger screens. It showed a young woman, perhaps no older than herself, with fiery red hair and a face dotted with freckles. Unlike the others, who seemed to exist in a state of tranquil suspension, this woman was engaged in an activity. She was painting. Her strokes on the canvas were broad and confident, her focus absolute. There was a passion in her movements, a spark of life that seemed out of place in this mausoleum of curated peace. Brenda felt a flicker of something akin to hope. This woman, the artist, still had a fire in her. She was not a placid doll. She was a creator. Perhaps she could be reached. Brenda moved closer to the screen, her movements slow and deliberate, careful not to startle the silent god who stood watching her. She raised a hand, pressing her palm flat against the cold, unfeeling glass of the monitor. It was a gesture of connection, a desperate attempt to bridge the digital and physical worlds that separated them. She tried to catch the artist's eye, to will her to look up from her canvas and see the frantic, silent plea in her expression. The narrator would describe the scene as a piece of tragic, silent theater. A woman trapped in a room trying to communicate with a woman trapped in a screen, while the architect of both their prisons looked on with a detached, academic curiosity. Brenda mouthed a single word, the same one she had used to try and warn the others, but this time it was infused with a desperate, focused energy. Help. For a long moment, nothing happened. The artist continued her work, lost in her world of color and form. But then, as if sensing a shift in the atmosphere, she paused. Her brush hovered over the canvas, her head tilted slightly, a subtle, almost imperceptible sign of curiosity. She slowly turned her head, not towards the camera, but just past it, as if looking at something in the corner of her room that was invisible to Brenda. A flicker of confusion crossed her features, a small human imperfection in the otherwise flawless tapestry of Derek's creation. It was the crack Brenda had been searching for. The hope surged within her, a wild, desperate thing. She pressed her hand harder against the screen, her knuckles white, her eyes boring into the monitor, trying to force a connection through sheer willpower. The response, when it came, was not from the artist. It was from the collective. On a dozen other screens, the placid, smiling women all stopped what they were doing at the exact same moment. As if guided by a single, unseen conductor, they all turned their heads in perfect synchrony and stared directly into their respective cameras. Their expressions were identical. It was not anger or aggression. It was a look of profound, condescending pity. It was the look a kind, patient adult gives a child who is throwing a tantrum. They saw Brenda's terror not as a valid response to her situation, but as a symptom of an illness they had already been cured of. One of the women, a blonde, with eyes as empty and blue as a summer sky, reached for a small whiteboard that was propped on her nightstand. She uncapped a marker with a slow, deliberate motion, and in neat, perfect block letters, wrote a message. She held it up to the camera, her serene smile never wavering. The words were a final devastating nail in the coffin of Brenda's hope. The sign read, "He is our shepherd. Do not fear his grace." The artist, the woman with the fire in her eyes, finally turned her head fully towards her own camera. She had seen the signs from the others. She looked at Brenda, a deep, sorrowful pity in her eyes, and with a slow, deliberate shake of her head, she turned back to her canvas and resumed painting. The crack had been sealed. The collective had closed ranks, protecting their savior from the disruptive influence of the unbeliever. Brenda stumbled back from the wall of monitors, the last vestiges of her hope turning to ash in her mouth. She was utterly, completely alone. She could not fight them. She could not save them. She could not reason with them. They were a part of him now, extensions of his will, and they would defend their cage with their dying breath. The only path left was not through them, but around them. The desperate, primal need to survive, which had been overshadowed by the shock of her discovery, now returned with a vengeance, a cold, clear fire in her veins. She would not become another smiling, empty doll in his collection. She would not thank him for her cage. She would burn it to the ground. The fire of her resolve was a cold, quiet thing. It did not burn with the heat of anger, but with the focused, blue intensity of a surgeon's laser. Her mind, once a chaotic storm of fear and paranoia, was now startlingly clear. The emotional part of her, the part that had longed for connection and despaired at its loss, was locked away. In its place was the nurse, the woman who could walk into a trauma bay, assess a catastrophic injury, and move with a cold, life-saving precision, while others panicked. She was now assessing her own trauma, her own catastrophic situation, and a plan began to form, not in a flash of inspiration, but in a slow, methodical process of elimination. She analyzed her enemy. Derek was a creature of data. His power was derived from his ability to see, to collect, to analyze. He knew her past, her fears, her medical history, her digital footprint. He could predict her reactions because he had the source code of her personality. A direct, physical confrontation was suicide. An appeal to reason was pointless. To fight him on his own terms in the digital realm he controlled was impossible. Therefore, the answer had to lie outside of his kingdom. The escape had to be analog. It had to be something unpredictable, something human in a way that defied data points and algorithms. It had to be a ghost in his otherwise perfect machine. His weakness was not in his technology, but in his ego. He was not a sadist who enjoyed her fear. He was a narcissist who fed on her dependence. He did not want to break her. He wanted to fix her. His God complex was absolute. He needed to be the savior, the one who could soothe the panic, the one who could bring her back from the brink. He had seen her medical files. He knew about the anxiety diagnosis from her early 20s, the occasional panic attacks she had suffered under the immense stress of her training. He would be expecting it. He would have a protocol for it. He would see a breakdown not as a failure of his system, but as the final, critical stage of her integration. The moment she became so overwhelmed that she had no choice but to accept him as her only anchor. She would not just give him a breakdown. She would give him a masterpiece. She began. It started with her breathing, a slow, almost imperceptible shift in its rhythm. Her training as a nurse had given her an intimate understanding of the body's machinery. She knew the precise cascade of physiological responses that constituted a true panic attack. She forced her breaths to become shallow, quick, a flutter in the top of her chest that denied her lungs the oxygen they needed. The first wave of genuine dizziness was a welcome sign. Her body was beginning to believe the lie her mind was telling. She let a small, choked sob escape her lips. It was not a sound of defiance. It was the sound of a dam breaking. She let her body slump, her legs giving way as she slid down the wall to the polished concrete floor, curling into a fetal position. She was offering him the perfect image of a broken woman, a tableau of surrender. Derek turned his full attention to her, his cold blue eyes now alight with a look of intense, clinical focus. This was it, the moment of catharsis. The narrator would describe the scene as a twisted parody of a doctor-patient relationship. He did not rush to her side. Instead, he turned to one of the smaller monitors on his wall, one that had been dark until now. It flickered to life, displaying a series of graphs and numbers. Her heart rate, her respiration, her galvanic skin response. There were sensors in the room. Of course there were. He was cross-referencing her physical state with the data he had on file, confirming the authenticity of her collapse. He was watching her body betray her, and he saw it as a victory. Brenda pushed it further. She allowed the manufactured panic to tip over into a genuine physiological response. The lack of oxygen made her vision swim. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Her hands began to tremble, an uncontrollable tremor that she did not have to fake. She clawed at her own throat, a classic, textbook symptom of air hunger. She was giving him every data point he could possibly want, feeding his analytical engine with a feast of her feigned suffering. On his monitor, her vital signs would have been a perfect match for acute panic. The data confirmed his diagnosis. The subject was breaking down exactly as predicted. His face was a mask of triumphant concern. He had her. She was his. He spoke, his voice a low, soothing lullaby of control. The words meant more for the cameras than for her. He spoke of safety, of release, of letting go. He was the calm in her storm, the anchor in her sea of terror. It was at that moment that she knew she had him. His focus was entirely on her performance, on his role as the savior. He was no longer the all-seeing warden. He was just a man, blinded by his own ego. He moved toward the pristine white door at the far end of the room, the one she had noticed earlier. A mild sedative. The narrator would describe him thinking, just enough to ease the transition. He needed a prop for his rescue, a physical tool to complete his therapeutic narrative. As his back turned, as he was momentarily consumed by the logistics of his salvation, Brenda made her move. It was not a large movement. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of her weight. Her hand, which had been clutching at her chest, slid down to the keychain tucked into the waistband of her pants. Her fingers, though slick with sweat, found the cool, familiar plastic of the medical alert fob. Her thumb brushed against the small, recessed button. It was a desperate, impossible gamble, an analog signal in a digital fortress. She pressed it, once, twice, 3 times. The code red, physical threat, location confirmed. There was no sound, no light, no confirmation that her silent, desperate plea had been received. There was only the feel of the button depressing under her thumb, and the sound of Derek opening the door to the medical supply closet. For a long, terrifying moment, nothing happened. The only sounds were her own ragged, manufactured gasps, and the soft clinical click of a medicine vial. Had it failed? Was she truly alone? And then she heard it. Faintly at first, a distant, almost imaginary sound, a high-pitched wail that cut through the sterile silence of the house. It grew louder, closer, a rising chorus of sirens screaming through the perfect manicured streets of the suburbs. The sound was a symphony of hope, a beautiful, violent intrusion into his perfect, silent world. Derek froze, the medicine vial in his hand. He turned, his face a canvas of pure, uncomprehending shock. The data had not predicted this. The algorithm had not accounted for this. The sound of the sirens was a variable he had never considered. He looked at Brenda, at the woman still curled on the floor, and for the first time, he saw her not as a patient, not as a project, but as an adversary. He saw the cold, clear fire in her eyes, and he knew he had been beaten. The flashing red and blue lights washed over the wall of monitors, bathing the faces of his silent, placid dolls in the colors of a world they had left behind, a world that was now, finally, breaking down the door. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights, shouting voices, and the cold, professional efficiency of law enforcement. Derek Fisher, the digital god, was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of quiet, narcissistic rage. The women, his collection of saved souls, were brought out one by one. They were not grateful. They were not relieved. They were terrified. They clung to the door frames of their perfect rooms, their serene faces twisted in confusion and fear. They were not being rescued. They were being evicted from paradise. The sight was the final, chilling testament to the depth of his crime. He had not just stolen their data. He had stolen their very ability to recognize their own captivity. Months later, the city was a different place for Brenda. The scars were not visible. But they were there, a network of quiet, lingering paranoia just beneath the surface. She had returned to her job, to the familiar chaotic rhythm of the hospital. She had reconnected with Kristen and Jody, a slow, painful process of rebuilding trust that was still ongoing. The investigation, led by Detective Victoria Lopez, had revealed the true, global scale of Derek's operation. He was not just a collector, he was a supplier. The emotional profiles he had meticulously crafted had been sold to a network of buyers in over a dozen countries, corporations, political strategists, other predators. He had been a pioneer in the burgeoning, unregulated market of human vulnerability. Her final step towards recovery, she had been told, was therapy. She sat in a quiet, tastefully decorated office, the scent of sandalwood and old books filling the air. Her new therapist was a kind, older man with a gentle voice and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, profound empathy. She found herself talking, truly talking, for the first time in a year. She spoke of the lingering fear, the feeling of being watched, the way she still covered the camera on her laptop. She spoke of the digital ghosts that haunted her. The therapist listened patiently, nodding in all the right places. When she was done, he leaned forward, his expression one of deep, impressive understanding. "It's a terrifying new world, Brenda," he said, his voice a soft, comforting murmur. "The lines between the public and the private have been erased. The question is no longer if we are being watched, but who is watching, and for what purpose." He paused, a small, thoughtful smile playing on his lips. "It reminds me of a fascinating case I read about, a man who believed he was a shepherd for lost souls." Brenda's blood ran cold. The specific turn of phrase, shepherd, a word she had never used in their sessions, a word that had only ever been written on a whiteboard. In a prison she thought she had escaped. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the kind eyes and the gentle smile. She saw the familiar, clinical curiosity, the detached interest of a collector admiring a new, particularly interesting specimen. The room, which had felt like a sanctuary just moments before, was now the same sterile white as Derek's command center. The cycle of the predator and the prey had simply found a new, more respectable face, and with that, their story came to an end. But it leaves one last question for you. If the one person you trusted with your deepest secrets used them as a weapon, who would you turn to? Share your answer in the comments below. See you in the next one.